Index investing or passive investing has grown more popular with investors. Even Warren Buffett touts the benefits of owning an entire index like the S&P 500 over the long term. An example of an index tracking ETF is BMO's S&P 500 Index ETF. It's the largest ETF in Canada that tracks this well-recognized and popular index. It provides exposure to the returns of the market cap weighted S&P 500 index at a low cost with a management fee of just 0.08%. This broad market ETF makes for an efficient building block in a portfolio, saving you time and effort while mitigating single stock risk. If you're looking for exposure to the largest and most liquid public companies in the United States, this ETF delivers an easy-to-use solution and instant diversification. Commissions and management fees and expenses all may be associated with investments in exchange-traded funds. Please read the ETF facts or prospectus of the BMO ETFs before investing.
Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that this information discussed today is not intended to be or construed as investment advice. Please consult a professional advisor before putting a loonie in any of these financial markets.
The dirty secret is that no one's ever going to get paid back.
People have the shortest memories when it comes to investment.
We just got to get Keefer into Bitcoin.
Hey, there's a bubble. Welcome back to Loonie Hour, episode 111. As always, joined by the three amigos once again. Keith Dicker, IceCap Asset Management with the San Fran jersey. And Rich Diaz, welcome back to the show, buddy. We missed you last week.
I missed you guys too, man. That was 109 weeks that we've spoken every week in a row for at least an hour, sometimes more, sometimes less. I really missed it, and I'm sorry to you guys, and I'm sorry to our listeners,
our fans.
Especially sorry to my mom because I didn't tell her that I wasn't going to be on the pod. So she was pissed off about that. No offense to you guys, but yeah, I was in New York City on business. I had a bunch of client meetings on Wednesday, and that rolled over into Thursday. New York City's amazing. I've never been there before, believe it or not.
What?
And yeah, never been there before.
Finance bros, never been to New York.
You've never been to New York before?
Finance bro had never been to New York, which was quite embarrassing. It was awesome. Yeah, I had loads of client meetings. Some of them went better than others. I got absolutely killed in one by a guy. You know, that's the thing on the sell side where you have your clients, they're chasing after your view, and then they give you lots of pressure and they push back on everything you say, and of course, and everything you say is consensus, etc., etc. So that was a really
Did you tell him about the Loonie Hour?
I did not tell him about the Loonie Hour, I'm afraid.
Well, that's your first mistake.
So you're doing the typical, New York Wall Street kind of stuff. And how were the hookers and blow afterwards? Was that fun?
We did not have time for that, sadly. It was very much all business. But I'll tell you one thing, Keith, you'll love this.
This is a family show.
This is a family show.
It's the classic Wall Street experience.
But wait, let me tell you the story. So what is absolutely a stereotype that is true is the vest, the Patagonia vests in Midtown. They're everywhere. Every person between every male a bunch of females too, but everyone's just walking around in loafers and a Patagonia vest with the collared shirt. I may not ever wear one again, but so there you go, Keith.
Speak for yourself,
you may have figured this out. If you're in New York, down in the Wall Street area or wherever the meetings are, and you're wearing a tie, everyone knows you're sell side.
Yeah, I was wearing a tie.
Yeah, immediately you just jump out. If you're wearing the vest or something,
So we for our listeners this week, couple things here before we get into the episode. Number one, of course, this is the final week to get Loonie Hour tickets to the live event in Toronto on November 30th, next Thursday. So we've got about 20 tickets left. So if you're listening to this episode and you've kind of been mulling it over, you might want to get over to the Eventbrite page ASAP before we sell the rest of the last 20 there. This week's episode, we have a very, very special guest. His name is Dr. Chris Keefer. He is the president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy. So if you've been following along with any of Rich's rants about the ESG transition and all this, I think we can all agree that it can't be done without nuclear. So we figured, why not get a nuclear specialist on the show to kind of discuss the ins and outs of that world. But after the interview with Dr. Keefer there, we are going to touch base on the federal budget. I know everybody wants to, get our commentary on on the updated federal budget, Airbnb regulations they came out with, all these housing changes, mortgage changes. We got CPI in Canada, and of course some commentary on financial markets. So we do have a bunch to dive into after this episode, but why don't we jump over to the interview with Dr. Chris Keefer right now? Dr. Keefer, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we're really excited, particularly Rich. But yeah, why don't you just introduce yourself for those that are maybe unaware? Obviously, we've followed a lot of your work on Twitter, but for those that haven't heard of you before, maybe just give us a quick little synopsis.
Yeah, sure. It's a bit of a strange story, to be honest. I'm an emergency doctor by day, often by night as well. And I developed this passion and interest in nuclear energy after my son was born, thinking of some of the big picture issues like climate change, and casting around looking for solutions, being solutions oriented. Learned that I lived in nuclear powered Ontario, where we phased out coal using nuclear, and had essentially the holy grail of a decarbonized grid, which is the basis of this kind of electrify everything agenda that's necessary to some degree for climate change. So that led me towards starting a podcast. It's a great way to educate yourself and have the opportunity to get in touch with experts and say, hey, will you chat with me for an hour? So I'm about 215 episodes into the Decouple podcast, and founded a grassroots nonprofit named Canadians for Nuclear Energy, which is made up of actually a number of doctors, but engineers, scientists, tradespeople, labor folks who believe that nuclear is really the cornerstone of a clean energy transition. So that's a bit of background. I'll try and keep it brief.
That's amazing.
No, that's great. That's exactly sort of why I'm really into it. I think it is basically the only answer, but everybody knows my views on that. I'm interested in sort of I have a bunch of questions. So Steve, you're gonna have to muzzle me at some point. I guess the first thing right off the bat, I think let's get with, what do you think is the biggest sort of challenge that you face, or that the nuclear energy sort of lobby or businesses face in Canada, and how do you see that sort of changing or playing out over the next few years? I mean, is there some good news? Is there some bad news? And yeah, what would you do if you were the king of Canada?
You know what? Honestly, I started this nonprofit with a number of other activists, I guess going on about 3.5 years ago. And the landscape was so different at that point. I mean, we started out, again, super grassroots, just some folding tables illegally put up in Nathan Phillips Square in Toronto with some really brutally, graphic design aesthetic brochures. We were talking to, the usual suspects in downtown Toronto, not the most influential people. And over the course of 3 years, we've really blown up. Met the Prime Minister, met a number of cabinet ministers. I go to Ottawa regularly. We've published a number of important reports, one on Safe Pickering, which is one of the big nuclear stations in Ontario that was threatened with being closed, another called the Case for Can-Do. So the landscape has dramatically changed, and in a way it's bizarre, to sort of get our wish list. So in terms of what's happening, well, just in the fall economic statement a couple of days ago, nuclear was included in the green bond. That was one of our big campaigns. Stephen Guilbeault, who's a former Greenpeacer and still our Minister of Environment and Climate Change, a principled, dedicated, consistent anti-nuclear activist, running that department. And in the initial green bond framework, nuclear was listed alongside the sin stocks of tobacco, smoking, gambling. So that was a big fight for us.
Is he so yeah, I wasn't overly aware of this, but is Guilbeault very anti-nuclear? And if so, if that is his view, why, have you asked him what his stance is on that?
I did chat with him actually at the big climate conference, COP. That was COP26 in Glasgow. I managed actually an ambush interview with him. He was giving a talk at the World Wildlife Pavilion called Powering Past Coal, and completely glossing over the fact that, really one of the only successful coal phase outs in the world happened in Canada, and it was powered by Canadian nuclear technology. The Ontario grid was 25% coal. We had 54 smog days a year in the big smoke here over in Toronto, and nuclear reactivations of a number of our Canada nuclear stations provided 90% of the energy required to get rid of that coal. So I confronted him on the way out of that session at COP and said, hey, again, given your longstanding commitments, your consistency opposing nuclear, how does that fly with the emerging scientific consensus, and even that of the IPCC, in which, all 4 of the pathways that see us staying under 1.5 degrees C model an increase in nuclear of between 150 and 500%. Like, will your anti-nuclear priors cloud your judgment? And it went a little bit viral. It led to a lot of media coverage. And it was really the first time, that we saw media coverage of nuclear in this light. Usually kind of like the climate debate in the early 2000s, you'd have a climate scientist and you have a climate skeptic, and the media slowly has moved towards not necessarily feeling there's a need to have balance from people that are a little wingnutty. And the typical thing with the media is to go and speak to, environmental expert in Greenpeace on nuclear, and frankly, they're activists. They're not folks who have a strong background or who have a balanced appraisal of what's going on in nuclear. So anyway, there's a big change there. I'm taking a long time to answer your question. Guilbeault is still in office, but in my opinion, he's been told, listen, if you want to keep your cabinet position, you got to change your mind because the government's come around on this. So we had, the Liberal Party federally. I think the way I characterize it is it was split between, the World Wildlife Organization essentially runs the Prime Minister's office. 3 of the 5 key staffers are former World Wildlife Fund folks, right? Very anti-nuclear. Guilbeault, very anti-nuclear.
Do you mean the pandas are running
the pandas running the Prime Minister's office? Right?
Not surprised.
So that's one side of the Liberal Party, and then you have vote-rich Ontario. You're not going to form government in this country if you don't win Ontario and Quebec. And vote-rich Ontario is full of nuclear, right? We have 76,000 people working in the sector. We have hundreds of supply chain companies. It's a massive economic stimulus here in a sort of precision manufacturing province. And those folks go out and vote. And so the Ontario Liberal MPs are going, hey, why are you slagging nuclear here? Why are you saying that nuclear workers are essentially equivalent of, folks, trading in like endangered species or whatever else was in sort of the sin stock category. So that was sort of the kind of wedge that I was able in my advocacy to sort of drive into that party, and particularly with a sort of pivot of conservative politics towards populism and towards courting, this private sector skilled trades unions, for instance. I think the Liberals are sort of feeling that need to sort of pivot back more towards, frankly, in their own electoral interests, towards not losing that contingent to, the Conservatives, as, happened here in Ontario with Doug Ford being backed by a number of skilled trades unions.
Hey guys, sorry to interrupt the show. Just wanted to mention that the Loonie Hours put out a survey. We're trying to survey our audience. We get a better understanding who's listening to the show. If we've brought any value to you over the last month, 2 months, 2 years that we've been doing this podcast, if you take 30 to 45 seconds out of your day and fill in the Loonie Hour survey, there's going to be a link in the show notes in the description on YouTube, on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, etc. We're going to ask you, again, your age, where you live, how many podcasts you listen to a week. This helps us understand not only who you are, but also helps our advertisers know to make sure it's the right fit. So to be honest, ultimately we're asking for a favor. We rarely ask our audience for things, but if you don't mind taking 30 to 45 seconds out of your day to fill in the Loonie Hour survey, again, in the show notes below, we greatly appreciate it.
Rich, hold on. I appreciate the answer here. I'm just kind of curious to get to the bottom of why Guilbeault would be against nuclear. And the reason why I'm asking that, not so much for his view, but like I would imagine like the reason why he's against it is probably why there's other skeptics that are maybe like not, because you look at all the benefits of nuclear and you're like, well, how come how come everybody's not for nuclear? Like, why are we shutting down, nuclear power plants in parts of Europe, for example? Like, there's got to be a reason, and I'm kind of just curious what that other side, that view is.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of reasons. I would say fundamentally, though, like so many of our opinions, they're not based in, a detailed review of the facts.
How dare you?
It's based on a feeling. It's based on being a part of a tribe, and with energy, it's so aesthetic, right? That idea of having a few solar panels on your house and having the EV in the driveway, and sort of doing your part and not having big centralized infrastructure appeals to a certain romantic part of the spectrum, right? And I mean, I've grown to really appreciate the entirety of the political spectrum. I think a healthy society needs balance. You need libertarians, you need lefties, you need everything in balance to have a healthy politics and a healthy society. So I mean, I don't begrudge people with that vision, but it's not realistic, right? And again, if you look on an evidence base, there there's very few large economies that have decarbonized our electricity grid, which again is only the first step. And what's the commonality between them? Again, we're talking grids with over kind of 5 to 8 million. Either they've got all the hydro in the world, like Quebec or Manitoba, BC, internationally, Norway, I think Paraguay, etc., or they've got a big chunk of nuclear. France has the most, 75% of their grid, but Sweden's another one. Switzerland's pretty low carbon, Belgium, and here in Ontario, again, essentially decarbonized grid using hydro and nuclear. So you have evidence of what works, and then you have this kind of aesthetic commitments. Obviously, this also goes back to fear of the bomb. Nuclear is a dual-use technology. It's a kind of sword and plowshare situation, and those sort of deep-seated fears and the, I guess, misapplication of those fears between two very different expressions of the technology, lie at the basis of this. My dad did duck and cover drills during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was quite anti-nuclear until I was able to lay the facts out in front of him. He came around as well. My sort of political aesthetic background's, pretty kind of lefty. Even I was a bit of a hippie when I was younger. I was never an anti-nuclear activist, but again, I think, going to medical school, getting a background a little bit in, empiricism and in learning how to assess the literature out there to see if it's any good, critical appraisal skills, that's kind of ultimately what turned me on this issue.
I want to jump in for a quick question as well. I know Rich is just dying to come back for his questions. But Chris, talk a little bit about, when was the last time a nuclear power plant was built in the West? Mm-hmm. And then sort of overlay on top of that, it's my view, it is what it is, but, most of the West has gone left-leaning from a political perspective over the last decade. And I know politics works like a pendulum, so we're likely going to be swinging back in the other direction now. Mm-hmm. And because of all this, I guess, heightened interest and focus on, trying to create a cleaner energy source, is now the time where we will see any new plants, either expanded or new ones? But answer the first question, and then jump over to that.
Yeah, so the West has been struggling, not just with nuclear, but with all major infrastructure projects, be it, Site C out in BC or Muskrat Falls, and hydro, building bridges, building tunnels, you name it, building airports. It's a crapshoot now. We've lost a lot of our capacity. We've deindustrialized in many ways. We've, offshored. And moved a lot of things to China, et cetera. And yeah, we're having our asses handed to us by, the Chinese. It used to be the Japanese, and the Koreans are very good at nuclear. And frankly, we used to be very, very good at nuclear. Our stations, we brought a large Canada reactor. We commissioned one every single year for 22 years. So 22 large reactors built in 22 years. You might hear, well, a nuclear plant takes forever to build. It's true. The average is 6 to 8 years to, from pouring that base mat to hooking up to the grid. That sounds like a really long time. For the climate alarmists, that doesn't seem fast enough. But we're talking about building in fleet mode here, right? And in that setting, you can bring on a lot of power quickly. The UAE, for instance, whether that's in the West, they just joined the BRICS, so who knows? But certainly, not a Chinese or a Russian example. They've decarbonized 25% of the electricity grid with a 15-year program where they had basically no one in nuclear 15 years ago, and they built 4 large Korean reactors, about 5,600 megawatts. They've got that done now. It's an incredible accomplishment. So nuclear can move quickly. Second part of your question, can you remind me again what that was? So last builds again would be Olkiluoto in Finland, a large European pressurized reactor, and then of course Vogtle, which is probably the most expensive building ever built on the face of the earth.
Where is that?
That's down in Georgia in the USA. Right. And that's the example. And, the anti-nuclear activists have moved away from more of the more outlandish sort of Simpsons based critiques of nuclear, because they know that the population is getting better educated, and that sort of fear, uncertainty, doubt stuff doesn't work as well anymore. And they're pointing towards, schedule and economics. And they have a point there in terms of the dysfunction in the West. And so the US, the supply chain was completely atrophied. Basically, the only people that had ever been on a nuclear construction site, I'm exaggerating a little bit, were in wheelchairs and old folks' homes. And so you're rebooting for a very, very complex construction project with an atrophied supply chain and workforce. In just as a sort of pushback, and in terms of what gives me hope in Canada, we are refurbishing, which means essentially renewing our CANDU reactors to an as new condition. They've been running for 30, 40 years. We can give them another 34 years of life with this major project. It's, $3 billion, $4 billion nuclear mega project. We're completing those, 6 months ahead of schedule, the last unit, and under budget. So, we are bucking that trend here in Ontario. We've developed an enormous amount of competence. We've got some great institutions here. And when you have that, when you have what I call the nuclear secret sauce, you can kick butt on these things and you can stamp them out, as we did in the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Hey guys, sorry to interrupt the show. Just want to remind you the Loonie Hour is going to be live in Toronto on Thursday, November 30th, starting at 6 p.m. The doors are going to open. It's going to be a live podcast, drinks, appetizers, laughs, good times. It's going to be so much fun. If you've ever been to any of our live events, I'm sure a lot of you can attest to that. But go check out our past live events on our YouTube channel there. You can check it out. Come meet hundreds of other Loonie Hour listeners. Come support the show. We'd love to see you there. There's going to be a link in the show notes below, whether you're watching this on YouTube or listening to it on Spotify or Apple. There's going to be a link in the description which will take you directly to the Eventbrite page where you can purchase a ticket. Hope to see you there.
So we're back with Dr. Keefer talking about nuclear power, and thank you again for joining us. My question is just sort of a bit more sort of meat and potatoes. Can you sort of address sort of some of the concerns that you see with respect to nuclear waste or meltdowns, a few of the scary things that people use as an excuse to not build, and sort of why those fears specifically are misplaced? Because we talked a little about policy, we talked a little about energy, but I think there's some people just want to know, like, what's to worry about, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, they're big questions. It's a challenge to answer them succinctly, because you've got to push back against a lot of, right? But just on the waste issue, I like to concede that nuclear waste is exceptionally dangerous, right? Fresh out of the reactor, without shielding, stand in front of waste for a matter of seconds, you've got a lethal dose, you're kaputs, right? But somehow in the history of civilian nuclear power, there's not been a single death from handling nuclear waste. Like, how exactly is that? And it's because we make dangerous things safe. And if you think about an analogy here, think about the aviation industry. How insane is it that we pack 200-300 people, men, women, and children, right, onto these real thin-skinned pressurized tubes, these airplanes? We put them up at 30,000 feet where there's not enough oxygen. Sometimes we fly over huge oceans, nowhere to land. There's, thousands of mission critical moving parts that need to be maintained perfectly. You need air traffic control, all of these variables that make flying incredibly dangerous. And yet we've found a way, through human ingenuity, to make it 17 times safer than driving. Managing nuclear waste, you got to take the fuel out of the reactor. You do that underwater. You move it into a spent fuel pool underwater. You wait 5 years, 10 years, and you put it into a steel and concrete lined bin. It's called a dry storage cask. And you kind of get a sense that sounds like a lot easier of a process than something like aviation. Of course, there's even better track record of safety with waste, because every year there's a few hundred people that die in aviation accidents. More about the waste. People say it's forever waste, right? After 400 years, you could hold one of our fuel bundles in your hands without even wearing gloves on. So that's the thing about nuclear waste, is it decays. It becomes less toxic with time. There are some long-lived isotopes, but they're blocked by the skin of your hand or a sheet of aluminum foil. So those are only a concern if you were to crush up. Again, this isn't like a glowing liquid waste. It's ceramic fuel pellets, right? You'd have to crush it up and do lines of it or eat it. And there's just not really any mechanism by which human beings would do that. So, I've gone and visited.
Well, let's never, underestimate the
human ingenuity.
Yes, absolutely.
Just to wrap up on the waste. I mean, I've been to the waste management facilities, right? And you have they're called dry casks. They're pretty huge, like maybe 14 foot tall, and they're, 8 foot, on the sides in terms of big rectangles. And you think about how much electricity that waste accounted for. And you're talking about powering cities for years. I mean, Bruce Power, for instance, that's 30% of the province's electricity, and their waste fits inside a Costco-sized mall. Is that a massive, unmanageable problem? Like, particularly compared to the alternatives. I mean, you can't see CO2, but it's an enormous mass, the amount of coal ash that goes out there. The other waste streams that are gaseous or liquid, those are hard sort of streams of waste to manage. A nuclear fuel pellet, or let's just say one CANDU fuel bundle, it looks like a log of wood, essentially, that's the dimensions, can power 100 homes for a year, right? And so uranium is just so energy dense that the waste is so energy dense, and we don't produce a lot of it. So the entire amount of nuclear waste that we've generated in Canada in terms of spent fuel would fit on one hockey rink stacked 32 feet or one telephone pole high, just to give you a sense of, visualizing it. Yeah. So in my mind, like, does it require care? Does it require solid engineering? Yeah, nothing as complicated as the aviation industry. Is it manageable? Absolutely. And I think that's a really silly reason not to pursue, again, a demonstrated decarbonization tool that we have. Yeah.
It sounds better though, Rich, than these wind turbine blades stacking up in landfills everywhere.
Well, yeah, and then not only that is that they're shipped here using marine diesel, and if you know anything about diesel and marine diesel specifically, it's one of those tankers is like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of cars worth of emissions. So that's a conversation maybe for another day. My question, is it frustrate you that the other types of let me rewind. Given your view on climate change, given your interest in decarbonizing, does it frustrate you how much press solar and wind get with respect to what they can deliver and when versus a proven technology and how it can deliver and when? Like, I know you're a doctor, you're not supposed to be emotional, but you obviously care about this. And I mean, it drives me crazy. So I'm just curious, like, how you feel about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in the bizarre phenomenon again of the nuclear advocacy community, we are sort of divided in the all of the above folks, and I'll say the all of the best folks. And so for me, again, there's so many aesthetic concerns, right? Or just an aesthetic vision of energy. And it feels good that we're harnessing natural flows of energy, and the sun is, it's not always going to be there, but billions of years before it turns into a red dwarf star and consumes the planet. It generates the winds. We're feeding off of nature. We're in balance, and people, I think, have a sense and a delusion that, once a solar panel is built, it'll be there forever, generously 30-year lifespan, a wind turbine, 20 years. And they are so energy dilute that we need just an enormous amount in terms of trying to replace existing capacity. You really can't compare the services that a nuclear plant provides, which are not, fossil fuels are absolutely incredible sources of energy. They're very
I'm sorry. You cut out there. So can you repeat that?
Yeah. We are a fossil fueled civilization. Look at everything around you. It's made out of oil, or it's enabled by fossil fuels in terms of, just every bit of, your computer, the framed wall behind you, that's an energy conversion. And almost always it was done with fossil fuels. But nuclear can actually replace some of those fossil fuel services with, reliable, dispatchable electrical generation. It can provide, district heating, which, would be very useful for Canada, or low-grade process heating. It can do propulsion of large boats, as we see with the Navy, et cetera. That's not all fossil fuel services, but it's a good number. Whereas wind and solar, they're stochastic, they're unreliable. It doesn't matter how many wind turbines you build, how much you overbuild a fleet. In Ontario during our peak demand, wind was at 6.5% of its capacity for 2 weeks, right? It shits the bed, it goes away. And so, yeah, part of what motivates me, and you hear the passion in my voice, is that, we're not setting out concrete goals. Okay, what do we want? We want to have the most effective decarbonization tools. We want to provide amazing jobs and stimulate the Canadian economy, right? We want to do this on the smallest land footprint possible. We want to make sure that we can maintain our grid and power our hospitals and our industry reliably, right? Which of our, low carbon energy technologies do that? There's very few. Hydro is great, but we've used up all the great hydroelectric spots. Geothermal, it's geographically constrained. So that really leaves us with nuclear, and we should be proud. 15% of this country is, nuclear powered. It's second only to hydro. And as I said, Ontario, has some hydro, but our economy is much larger than what Niagara Falls can do, basically. And so we went coal, but then we used nuclear to get rid of that coal, and that's a good model for other hydro constrained provinces like, say, Nova Scotia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, etc.
So can I just ask one more question, boys, and I'll pass it back to you guys? It's like, so looking ahead, what do you see are your biggest sort of challenges? And I know we're sort of winding down. We gotta wind down this interview. And thank you very much again for joining us. But I just want to say, like, what do you think is like the biggest sort of, what do you think what are the biggest challenges maybe over the next like 2 or 3 years? And then maybe what are the things that you like, what can like regular people do? Should we write to our MPs and say enough with the solar panels? Let's get serious. Or do we just I guess I don't want to tell people how to vote or whatever it is, but you know what I mean? Like, what can regular people do to sort of, if they support your sort of vision for decarbonization and that kind of thing?
Well, listen, I mean, we're open to donations. Go to www.c4ne.ca.
We already gave you a free. Sorry, you can repeat that.
www.c4ne.ca. We are, funded in this manner, so we do appreciate that. And again, not to toot our horn too much, there's been other factors, but I mean, this has been a good news story. We mentioned the green bond, nuclear. We fought to have it in the investment tax credit. It's there. The Canadian Infrastructure Bank has done $1 billion loan for, the West's first small modular reactors being built at Darlington. Pickering looks like it will be refurbished. That's 15% of Ontario's baseload electricity, which we led a campaign to save. There's plans to build another 8 new reactors in Ontario. We signed a deal with our Export Development Bank with Romania for a sovereign debt-backed deal. All the money lent to Romania is going to be spent in Ontario because they're building a couple new Canada reactors. I mean, there's good news story after good news story after good news story. And
so it's been a good year for you.
I mean, one of our slogans is, the best climate solutions belong in every party. The Conservatives certainly vocally back nuclear. The Liberals have done, not to use the pun too much, but a U-turn on nuclear. And the NDP is feeling the heat because just this week, for instance, the Ontario Federation of Labor unanimously backed a pro-nuclear resolution. There's an emerging consciousness here that wind and solar, don't provide jobs to Canada because the supply chain is basically all in China. And the install jobs are low skilled. They're hard to unionize. They're what I call the sort of Carney version of clean energy jobs.
Sorry, Mark Carney or
like Carnival, like, people going town to town to do a Carney job, right?
Okay.
Whereas again, nuclear
Rich wasn't exposed to that when he was younger.
All right.
Yeah.
So, nuclear provides these intergenerational, I meet guys and they're like, Candu's fed my family for 3 generations. And these are, 6-figure income jobs going to folks who, maybe have a high school or college degree and then get trained up on the job into, incredibly high levels of competence, not to mention the, highly trained engineers and PhDs and everything else, but there's a job for everyone in nuclear. And they're good jobs. And, you go to a nuclear community and there's a reason why people living next to a nuclear plant are the most adamantly pro-nuclear people you'll find. They have an incredible tax base. They have incredible facilities, sports facilities, et cetera, and awesome jobs. So I think I'm sort of veering off from your question there, but, lots and lots of good news. What are the challenges? I mean, this is interesting. And, I think, you try not to get political, but politics are important. As I said, the federal Conservatives, vocally pro-nuclear. But I'm actually concerned that they're sort of biased towards small government, no real role for government, maybe some free market fundamentalism actually really threatens the Canadian nuclear sector. Cutting regulation and trying to create a business-friendly environment, I think works well and plays well in the West, where it's mostly a natural resources game. When we're talking about central Canada, again, there's natural resources here, but a lot of it is in manufacturing. And our manufacturing sector is competing internationally. And there is no free market there. I mean, every country is trying to stimulate their manufacturing sector. I mean, think of aviation, like the US goes to bat for Boeing, or EU countries go to bat for Airbus. And, we've gone to bat for Bombardier. You need a different sort of industrial policy, which does require some government intervention. And nuclear does need that. My argument to them would be that this is a strategic sector. You don't privatize your military. And, there's lots of private companies involved in the nuclear supply chain, but it is an area which requires some government oversight and obviously government oversight, but also involvement, particularly if we want to preserve our incredible nuclear legacy as, a reactor designing country. There's only 3 major types of reactors in use around the world. Boiling water reactors, pressurized water reactors, and the CANDU. So we have an incredible legacy. It's one of Canada's top 10 engineering achievements. It's in jeopardy right now, partially because of a lack of national nuclear or just industrial policy. So that's, while I'm enthused by the Conservatives, vocal support for nuclear, there's work to be done there in terms of, I think, educating them on, what's unique and different about nuclear compared to, say, Canadian oil and gas.
Cool. Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Keith, I don't know, Rich, do you guys have any final questions here?
I just have it's not a question. It's just, I think in my mind, it's an obvious fact. And, the challenge for nuclear, it's not that, everything that you did mention to us, that it's, all the positives, and there's always negatives for everything as well. It is the fact that, the climate zealots out there have chosen not to support that avenue. Instead, they've gone another direction. So we can jump up and down all we want about, maybe one solution is better than another. But until that world turns and they say, yeah, you know what, we don't need windmills, let's put it all towards nuclear. It's going to be a struggle. I really, even though there are small victories taking place, in my mind, there is a much larger group that it's not just a Canadian decision that's being made. There's some pretty big global factors taking place here, and they've decided not to back this horse. And maybe that will change. Maybe that will change when this pendulum swings a little bit. But I just love the conversation today. I think a lot of our listeners are going to say, wow, I didn't know that was happening and it existed. But I was just thrilled to hear you today, Chris. That was great.
Yeah, I can't help myself. One bit of pushback I'd give you is that I think, I've chosen to largely ignore the environmental NGOs. If you think about them as a population demographic, this is a tiny number of people. They're well funded, and I'll give them that. They're very capable. In terms of our strategy, I kind of copy paste a lot of what they do in terms of things like our House of Commons petitions. I was inspired by their tactics. We insert our own messaging, and we've been very successful. But in terms of who votes, like, we pivoted very early to go, listen, there's 76,000 people working in the sector. They know it, they value it, they understand it. That's kind of like a voting block. Politicians will listen to that. Like, we've got to think strategically, I think, when we're, putting forward an issue that we care about. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot to celebrate. Things are moving in a great direction here. I listed off probably 10 points there in terms of positive developments. Sometimes I think, hey, I can hang up my shingle now and get back to just doing medicine all the time. But there's always more challenges. Nuclear, if I want to sort of steel man the opponents, it's hard. It takes your best people. It takes highly competent institutions. It's pretty inspiring meeting the people that work in it, the professionalism they have. And this is the thing, Ontario in particular, we've developed that expertise. We've developed those institutions. We're very well suited, governments lining up on the federal, provincial level. So I think we're at the beginning of something that's pretty exciting. Of course, the best time to do nuclear was 10 years ago. And, the cost of capital was essentially, interest rates went negative in the 2010s.
They always stay low. We've been told repeatedly that interest rates never go up.
But the next best time is now, right? That's
Last question. I know we have to go. Last question, Dr. Keefer. Do you speak German by any chance? Because there's a few people in Bavaria that I think would really benefit from your activism. And yeah, so if you're bored of Canada or you think you've reached all your goals in Canada, I would suggest you pick up and head to Germany because they need to give their head a shake. So.
I agree. We actually have had an event with climate James Hansen in Berlin, protesting the closure of their last 6 nuclear plants. So yeah, been there, done that, but more to do for sure.
Okay, thank you again,
Dr. Keefer. It's amazing what you've been able to accomplish. Like you said, just a few years at this, and the podcast is the Decouple podcast, correct?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah,
okay,
it's pretty wonky, but good deep dive on lots of energy topics, not just nuclear, and a little bit of politics, environmental philosophy. So check that out. And if you want to support us, we take no money from industry, which is part of what keeps us dynamic and with more exciting messaging than comes out of an industry that's afraid of its shadow. So if you go to c4ne.ca and find the donate button, we'd really appreciate that.
We'll put a link to that in the show notes. But appreciate your efforts. Keep fighting the good fight. Thanks for coming on the show.
My absolute pleasure, guys. Happy to come back anytime.
Yeah, it was a good interview there with Dr. Keefer. I think very insightful for those that aren't really I don't think there's a lot of Canadians that are spending a whole bunch of their spare time studying the energy grid here in Canada. So
it's just amazing to hear this conversation. My comment is that, you guys, we're quite serious when we wear tinfoil hat sometimes, but I believe, and I think everyone else would agree as well, that there's some pretty big global groups that are driving the agendas for a lot of the West these days, and they decide which direction we're going to go. And it includes media coverage and education and you name it.
The bug-eating crowd.
Yeah, it just seems really odd that nuclear is not even involved in the solution. So, hopefully this will change, and that, that could make things a lot better for us. But Rich, thanks for putting that interview together. That was a lot of fun. I hope everyone appreciates it.
Yeah, so I agree. I mean, you're welcome, Keith. That was awesome. I mean, I agree with you. The like willful kind of ignorance and the perpetuation of like silly myths, I think, are both dangerous. They're not helpful. And I think, I mean, with respect to the other renewables, I think maybe they're part of the solution, and they can be for certain countries. I know Portugal's done really well with wind or what have you. But the fact that, for example, Germany is having basically an industrial recession and now has to subsidize their Mittelstand, which is like the small companies in the southern part of Germany and western part of Germany, to the tune of $28 billion, billion euros, excuse me, in order to lessen the impact of much, much higher energy costs as a direct result of them shutting down 6 nuclear power plants that, by the way, had another lifespan of 20 or 30 years. I mean, to me, that kind of the sort of the hubris, the arrogance with respect to that, I think is just mind-blowing. There is some positive signs, Keith, where we didn't talk about this with Dr. Keefer because he's more of a Canadian focused analyst and activist, but Sweden has basically made a U-turn on this. They just sealed a deal. I think it was a cross-party sort of like either deal or promise to basically recommit to nuclear energy. Japan is now, after Fukushima, after sort of the fallout, pardon the pun, is now recommitting to nuclear energy. We give the Chinese a lot of shit for building coal power plants. I think deservedly so. They're absolutely pot committed to building loads more nuclear power plants. Korea just finished another one. So I think that, despite these sort of global forces pushing us towards wind and solar, which I think are just bogus, I think ultimately, hopefully, Keith, the market will win out, and it's just an unambiguously positive thing for people. Again, if you care about climate change, I think it's quite clear where we need to go.
Hope is an awesome strategy.
No, but what I'm saying is you're seeing it's happening. I mean, the headlines are clear.
Speaking of hope, we had the federal budget in Canada here.
Rich, normally you and I are the funny ones, hey? And Steve
know.
holds it back, but boy, that was the deadpan Loonie Hour humorous quote of the year, Steve.
That
was outstanding.
So Freeland's budget will include an additional 20.8 billion over the next 6 years. Again, obviously that assumes they stay in power, and they'll run a $40 billion deficit this year, and all of this assumes no recession. So Keith, you actually highlighted the chart, which we'll put up here for their economic projections, which is like there's no recession in sight at all over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this quite a bit. And so from an economic forecast perspective, it's beyond me. We live in a cyclical world. Our economy is cyclical and all that stuff. Yet a recession is never forecast. Like, that will never happen. Like, how dare you suggest that's going to happen? And because of that, every single policy forecast that come out of our governments, it doesn't matter if they're left or right or up or down, it's that the future always looks amazing. It's amazing. So this one here, though, so the chart that I sent, I think we're going to share it here on as
you had the long-term projection of federal debt, correct?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So showing, debt to GDP. And some people say, well, let's look at the absolute value of debt. And I'm a big believer in that as well. Like, just stack up the chips, right? How high are they or how low are they and all that? And then the other view, of course, is, well, if you have enough, it's like your house, right? How much house can you buy? It's dependent upon your income. So that's why, with a country, they'll always compare your debt to GDP. So debt is what you borrowed, and GDP is really your income. You're coming in for the country. But the Canadian forecast that just came out in the fall economic statement, it's showing that debt to GDP will continue to decline over I think it's 5 years, 8 years. I'm not looking at it right now.
It basically just like it almost falls to zero.
Yeah,
a child drew that chart, by the way.
It goes
There's a few crayons on it. I think, Rich, you're right. So let's talk about that. How does that happen? So it means, first of all, if economic growth stays flat, by default, means the debt has to decline. And we know that ain't happening because there's deficits, as far as we can see. And then on top of that, interest rates have to come down, because even if growth stays, even if, just say the government manages to not borrow any more than what they're currently doing, so the outstanding debt will not increase. Just with higher rates, with debt rollovers, it means the debt increases on its own, right? So to get debt coming down with the economy flat, it means like some kind of magical unicorn has to come riding in to do that. And then the other side of it is, economic growth. It has to, grow. And again, the way a cycle works, when you have expansion, what happens next is slowing growth, then a recession. It just cleanses out the system. So it's beyond me how anyone looking at this forecast for debt to GDP that just came out of this fall economic statement for the Canadians, yet it's going to play out. So therefore, by default, it means, hey, if we do get a recession, the deficits are going to blow out even more, or they're going to have to raise taxes. And as the Minister of Finance, she did not deny that taxes would not increase if that's the case. So again, we're going down this slippery road. And as bad as that economic statement looked yesterday, the government put this incredibly positive spin on it. And we'll go into that, because the whole spin was about housing. And because that's on the top of everyone's mind right now. But and again, if you're into numbers, which I think everyone should be, it's going to be really difficult for us as an economy with our debt load to come through there. I mean, like we can talk about the
Rich, you got some comments?
Wait, just like really quickly,
yeah.
Steve. Let me just jump in there, Keith, for 1 second. Just as a reminder, it's important people note that when they talk about this number of 40%, 42%, 43%, that's federal government debt to GDP. But it's important to note there's other types of government. So our gross general government debt to GDP is over 100, and that's the wrinkle that I think is constantly. I mean, here's my tinfoil hat now for you. I think they purposefully ignore that because it sounds better. They can say it's the lowest in the G7, which is total bullshit. Basically, the point, you have to incorporate the other parts of the government when you're thinking about debt to GDP. So when you look at America, debt to GDP, it's over 100. That's general government debt to GDP. They don't just use the federal portion of whatever. You know what I'm saying? So you have to just. Anyways, that's sorry that I needed to jump in there because that's an.
Well, yeah, it's the provinces ultimately. Like Keith, you've flagged provincial debt for since we started this show.
Yeah. And I think you just made a really good point, Rich. Because this debt to GDP is federal debt, and of course there's other obligations that the government owe, and they'll say, well, it's offset against assets and everything. But the GDP number, it's the entire country, right?
Right. Yeah, sorry. You said it better than I did. Sorry.
Yeah, so it's GDP coming from Alberta and Quebec and PEI and all these places. And so, you would think, if you want to be, crystal clear on communicating what the true fiscal position is, you have to include provincial debt as well. So you can effectively double that number. But
no, you can. It's more than double. It's 100. It's 100. So anyway, sorry. Please continue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for example, for what they're expecting for next year, I think the deficit is now going to be, the forecast to be 46.5 billion. And people tend to know their eyes gloss over. Steve doesn't, because Steve's selling houses out there for billions. So he knows that's a real number. But to give you an idea, so 46 billion just for interest on the debt, right? That's just interest. Think about it. This is what the feds are spending for childcare, 25 billion. They're spending 22 billion on employment insurance. Our national defense, 26 billion. So again, the interest on our stacked debt, the chips are getting stacked up higher and higher. This is going in the wrong direction. And people chat with me, I always tell the story about we just finished a 40-year cycle with rates always going lower, and now they're going up, boys. Now they're going. Speaking of, Rich has a boy story anyway, right?
We need Tiff Macklem to help us out here. Come on, Tiff. Start cutting rates. We'll get into that, but I mean, a couple other interesting notes out of the federal budget there on the housing front. So they earmarked like another $15 billion. I believe that's just like CMHC rental construction. I think a lot of these projects are still not that economically viable, so we'll see how much of those funds actually get absorbed. But the other two that they mentioned was they came out like this like mortgage banking thing that they were like, oh, we're going to protect Canadians, but like all that stuff is already happening. So what they said is, oh, like, you know, if you're facing financial hardship, the banks need to like allow you to work with their, you know, extend amortizations and do all that. So the reality is banks have already been doing that. So they basically kind of like bundled up this like package to make it look like they were doing a whole bunch of stuff, but it really is political theater. And our buddy Ron Butler there kind of debunked a lot of that on the mortgage side. A guy that has a lot of close intel with these large banks, and free plug will be at our event on the housing panel there on November 30th. So, but they also announced the Airbnb thing, which I thought was kind of interesting. I'm kind of curious your guys' perspective because it's definitely
Can you explain what it is first? And because I'm not sure I heard it.
Yeah. So there's a lot of again, housing crisis. You know, who do we blame? You know, it's never the government's fault. It's, you know, so, you know, I think the scapegoat, and, you know, rightfully, I think they have impacted the housing market, right? It was the foreign buyers. Now the conversation I've just noticed has been turning like investors are the problem. This is why we have a housing problem in Canada. It's investors, and in particular, Airbnb operators. They're the ones to blame. It has nothing to do with, you know, decades of low interest rates and excessive population growth, et cetera. It's now the investors. And so we saw like 2 weeks ago, the BC government came out and said, listen, we're enacting provincial regulations around Airbnb that municipalities are going to have to follow. And then we had the federal government come out again during this budget and saying, if you're operating an Airbnb, you are not allowed to deduct the expenses against the income, right? So if you think about a traditional property investor in Canada, when you have a rental property, you have revenue, and then you have your expenses, and you can deduct all those expenses. For example, you can deduct your mortgage interest costs, not your principal. You can deduct the mortgage interest. You can deduct the property taxes that you pay. You can deduct, maintenance of the property, strata fees, etc. So obviously that helps offset some of the, the revenue or profits and lowers your tax bill. So what they're saying is that, well, we want to make Airbnb less lucrative for investors. And so we saying you cannot deduct any of the expenses. So again, as an Airbnb operator, I think that's a huge dent to your profit and loss statement. So I'm kind of curious your guys' thoughts. I don't have a strong opinion on it because I think it's so politically divided that like you'll have two people in the spectrum that say, oh, Airbnb's the worst thing ever. It's creating this affordability problem, and people are basically operating hotels in residential zoning. They should never be allowed to do that. Versus the other people that will say government is getting too much into the free market. This is a bit of a slippery slope into, hey, maybe we remove expenses on traditional investors in 2 or 3 years from now.
So I have a question and a comment. The question is, out of how many households, how many units of Airbnb are there? Like, is it a material number? And I guess maybe that's something we can research at a different date, unless you know.
I think the numbers are just like, it's hard to really get a number. Like people will say, I think the way they say there's 30,000 Airbnb. So Krista Freeland's own thing is she believes across the country there's going to be 30,000 additional units freed up.
Okay, well that was come to my second point.
That's Krista Freeland's view. So people will say, well, it's 30,000 Airbnbs in Ontario. But just because you have an Airbnb in Ontario doesn't mean that people are going to stop Airbnb and they're going to immediately open up that extra bedroom or that extra unit's going to end up on the rental market. There's people that
I disagree with you on that. So I think one of the things also, and this is probably good in the sense, one of the things I think is maybe not good for a housing stock, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but having an asset that's basically underutilized. Right? Because if you can, I've made this point before, which is if you can make up your mortgage, if you can rent your apartment for 10 days a month, 10 days a month, and the rest of those other 20 days, they're empty, then doesn't that deduct net from your overall housing stock? I mean, the Airbnb guy's happy, the person who purchases happy, and in some ways you should be able to do whatever you want with your asset. I get that point. But if we're trying to deal with a housing crisis, aren't these assets sort of underutilized from having?
I guess it just depends on how much government control. Like, I mean, if you've got a spare bedroom in your house, Keith's got whatever he's got, a 5-bedroom house, when he only uses 3 bedrooms, are you going to force him to rent out the other 2?
No, that's fair enough. But what I mean is, like, in downtown, the condos, and we know there's condos in Toronto that might be filled, 30% of the year.
I can tell you in Vancouver, there's definitely like wealthy people that own $4 million pied-à-terres, right? Because they're like, I come to Vancouver for 3 months of the year, and this is a secondary property for me. And now, like, again, now you're having to pay empty homes tax, speculation tax, because the government thinks that you're not using that property how they want you to use it. And so I get it. I do think we're starting to lean in this direction that becomes a bit of this totalitarian, state that is dictating on how everybody should be using their property. And so, again, I'm not saying there's like a right or wrong answer. I just find it very interesting that, like, the solution in Canada always just seems to be let the government control it, more taxes, let them regulate it. And I just don't, and we haven't really solved
that was what I was going to say. So, I mean, you make a really good point. So maybe I have to reconsider my view on this. But ultimately, I think it's what Keith talks about all the time, is that they're just dealing with a symptom of the issue. The issue is we do not have enough housing stock, full stop. And we just have way too many people coming in, and we're not building enough homes. And, shifting the decks on the Titanic, as it were, is not going to work.
We're just trying to redistribute the pie. Right? Yeah. So just to summarize again, if Krista Freeland, her math is correct, that she believes with this new Airbnb, if she believes there's 30,000 units that will be freed up out of the Airbnb pool because the math no longer works and the government's telling them what to do. 30,000 units. So every year we're on average, we're completing about 220,000 new housing completions per year in this country. So 220 plus you freed up the 30 for, it's a one-time 30, right? So 250,000 housing units for the year. When you're adding 1 million people,
is it really that low, Steve? Is it really only 200,000?
So we've actually averaged about 200,000 housing completions per year over the last decade.
That's units. That's like apartments and condos and Keith's mansion and all that shit.
Yeah, so if you account like single family houses and then how many condo dwelling units and how many townhouses, so it's like, again, I see what they're trying to do because it is a political win, right? Like there's a lot of people that are against Airbnb and you can see all these other cities in North America that are coming out against it and putting in regulations. So like it's an easy political win, but I think we are kind of taking our eyes off of the big picture here.
Okay, are you guys ready? Are you finished?
Yeah. Yes, sir. We're finished.
Steve is like 100% correct here. I mean, so first of all, our view on this is irrelevant. Instead, you always take the view, this is where they're going. This is the road that they've gone down. And I disagree with it. I think you guys know how I feel about it. But just to be clear, people are making investments. They're using their own private capital. And it doesn't matter if it's real estate or they're opening a donut shop or an IT company. They've taken on the risk to invest in something, and now they're running it. And now for government to get increasingly more involved in their business. Again, some people say, well, no, you need more units and all that stuff. It's incredibly naive to believe there will be no secondary and third and fourth repercussions from this. So
that we can't calculate today.
Absolutely. I mean, the quantitative side of it is just doesn't work. I mean, Steve, you just clearly explained you get a one-time boost of. I'd be surprised if it's going to be 30,000 units. I don't believe any numbers coming out of the fall economic statement, as we've already said. I think it's hopeless. So these policy responses, and if you go through the fall economic statement, the whole thing is housing, the housing crisis and rental crisis unit. And governments have to respond. They have to respond to social crises, and this is clearly one. But as Rich, you mentioned a few minutes ago, they're treating the symptom of a much bigger problem. They're trying to affect supply, but really it's demand that is the key driver here. And if they just simply said, hey, no more immigration for 5 years, and people are going, oh, can't believe you said that. You're not allowed to say that. You're canceled. You're finished, Loonie Hour. But, it's a dramatic statement, but it's just simply you're dealing with supply. But over to, Steve, the comment you made, there in Vancouver, hey, people have second and third homes, right? It's just the way the world works. And all of a sudden, foreign investors start hearing that, wow, if you buy a secondary home or property in Vancouver or Toronto or Whistler or, I don't know, any place north of Montreal, Rich, wherever people go there.
Tremblant and Laurentians. I want to be in a Laurentian elite. That's all I've ever aspired to be.
There you go. Or you go Charlevoix, maybe, in that area, which is quite beautiful. Guys, one of the best road trips in the world. You drive along the northern side of the St. Lawrence in Quebec in the fall.
It's amazing.
Great food. Yeah, it's quite nice. But however, the point is that you're making a statement. Say, hey, Canada is now closed to foreign investment. You want to come in, we're going to make it pretty friggin' hard for you. But again, like we're into this, like there's lots of conversations now, and we've talked about it quite a bit about per capita data for Canada, and it's this employment growth number, and so they say, well, it's driven by the universities, we're driven by we need more skilled people and stuff like that. We've flooded. We've had 10 years with no price discovery in the bond market, a decade with near zero rates, and we're bored, except and then when the pandemic hit, they gave everybody money. Not everybody, I know a lot of people did struggle, of course, but on an aggregate level, everyone money, no one lost. And now all of a sudden they're just shocked that there's this imbalance in the housing market. And they think, oh, we just need to build more supply. No, it's like, Rich, if you drew one of your great charts, it goes up and down, trending, bottom left, top right. You draw your trend line through there. You know the kind of chart I'm talking about.
Yeah. No, I'm nodding.
Yeah. This might be a pickup line. You never know, right? You go through this. But the current data point, it's way above that trend line. And this will not be fixed politically. We have a big political year coming up next year around the world. I know Canada's scheduled for 25. Maybe it happens before then if the guys in the orange shirts might fess up here. But, we got some struggles coming up. And again, these numbers, like what you just listen to them. Like, for example, here's one quote I wrote down. This is from the Minister of Finance. We're going to build thousands upon thousands upon thousands of new homes. Like, what the heck does that mean? Like, it's just
I can tell you, like,
it's theater. I'm not finished. I'm just getting warmed up, Steve. Okay? Canada is a global investment destination. No, it ain't. You start doing this, it is not a global, Climate change policy is an economic policy.
He's right about that.
What the fork does that mean?
He's right about that, which we keep going. We'll get to that some other day, maybe, but he's right about that. And not the way he thinks, but carry on.
What? We have fiscal restraint.
No.
Are you kidding me?
That's a joke, obviously.
There's no restraint going on here.
Hey, Rich.
Restraint is with truthiness.
So
was that a rant? Did I just do a rant? Was that like a rant?
I gotta cut you off here, Rich. You're I actually want to get back to your point, but I was just to put it into context for people. And I know people will kind of push back on this number, but so we're going to run a $40 billion deficit this year. Again, 10 years ago. But in 2009, during the depths of the global financial crisis, Canada ran a $33 billion deficit. So, no, again, I know the GDP picture has changed, so you have to adjust for that and inflation and whatnot. But like that kind of puts things a little bit into context.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the problem is it's not, deficits aren't in and of themselves a bad thing. Again, this is the pushback I have against you guys. It's A, what are you doing with the money? And B, what stage of the cycle you're in? Remember, like, again, this is my view, and John Maynard Keynes is one of my heroes. I make no bones about that. And his point was that when your economy is contracting and there's a severe contraction in domestic demand, governments should step in and spend money to alleviate some of that contraction, that pressure. That's not what's going on now. Unemployment rates are very, very low. Participation rates are actually quite high in Canada relative to history. So we're in a situation where, by all rights, if you followed Keynes, you'd say, actually, we should be trying very hard to actually restrain spending, try to run up some budget surpluses, build up some reserves, and to in such a way that when we do have a material downturn, that then the government should come in and alleviate some of that pressure. That's not what's happening, which is why it's so dangerous, which is why it's inflationary. And this is why the Bank of Canada, as try as they might, they do between the lines say that it's inflationary, right? You're above the potential GDP, and Canada's deficit spending at a time when you have such low unemployment, e.g. full employment, is basically fiscally irresponsible. And that's ultimately what we're dealing with. And so,
but the problem with Keynesian economic.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, here we go.
Save it for the live event, pal.
Well, but the challenge with it, I mean, he's rolling over in his grave because, as you said, Rich, during times of economic downturn, yes, stimulate with deficits and lower taxes, which that's never happened and so forth. But during the good times, run a surplus, pay off your debt and everything. And that part has been forgotten.
Right.
But Steve, what is the deficit forecast coming up?
For this year?
Ballpark.
40 billion.
Rich, how much in interest is going to be paid?
I get you, man.
Interest only?
No, but that's my
billion.
point. But that's my point.
Billion. See what I mean? Like, this doesn't work, guys. Like,
but you're right. Keynes would be rolling over his grave because he made it very clear that when you're in good times, you have to restrain your spending, and they don't do that. They don't care. This is why, by the way, MMT doesn't work. But anyway,
I got one more thing to add to the budget, and then we'll shift gears. But we did have, and I got to mention this because we actually had him on as a guest in the show. We had Professor Michael Geist. So we had him on to discuss the internet law, basically, or legislation that the government had passed, which was effectively that they were going to stop showing news on Canadian social media, right? So if you go on Instagram or Facebook today and you wonder why you can't get Bloomberg News or CBC News or not CBC, but any of these, I'm assuming, I think it was non-Canadian. If you can't get a lot of news,
you can definitely get CBC News.
No, it's all that stuff. It's the sharing.
It's all that stuff. So anyways, they basically blocked it. And so what's happened effectively is that obviously these Canadian media companies, which it was the legislation was supposed to help, is actually hurt them from a revenue perspective because nobody basically sees their news articles anymore. And so now the government is basically bailing out the Canadian news outlets after an impact of a disastrous Bill C-18. So they're now going to cover 35% of journalist labor costs, and they've increased their per employee claim from $55,000 to $85,000.
Crazy.
So the measure is going to cost an extra $130 million over the next 5 years. Again, so the Canadian government is increasing the tax credit rate from 25% to 35% per employee.
Hey, Rich, that's Keynesian economics.
No, it's not.
Awesome. That's what you do, man. Spend, baby.
No fucking way. That is not what that is, man.
Anyways, I thought you would enjoy that, but
let's talk about American Thanksgiving. I think we're almost done.
We got Canada CPI. I don't know if you want to touch briefly on that. We had some comments from Tiff Macklem, our buddy there, as well.
Okay. You go with
Canada CPI came in at 3.1% year over year. Again, people are going to argue about what's driving it and government stats and what to believe. Ultimately, yes, a large reason for the decline was gasoline prices. Those are volatile. But the biggest drivers again of CPI, I think it's over 50% of the increase is mortgage interest costs and rents.
Brent,
So-
baby. Brent's 8.2. I'm looking at the thing now. But no, the big driver was, by the way, if you X out, I mean, if you remove all the stuff going down, everything else is going up. That's my old joke
For
there.
sure.
But if you do X out the energy component, I think it's like 3.6%. So there's still quite a bit of inflation. But the thing that I thought was interesting was, just doing a quick little math here. We're still running at 0.3 per month. So what's 0.3 times 12? It's 3.6. I mean, it's still well above. That annualized rate is still well above target. So
And the Bank of Canada's closely watched 3-month average of core inflation is running at 2.95. So kind of within their 1 to 3 target. But
yeah.
again, everyone's sitting here like arguing about like the numbers. I think at the end of the day, I think we can all agree that the Bank of Canada is effectively done. There were some comments that came out yesterday from the Bank of Canada's Tiff Macklem, who basically said, quote, rates may be, quote, restrictive enough. More downwards pressure on inflation is in the pipeline, and he believes that excess demand is gone. So excess demand where corporations felt they can continue to pass on price increases is no longer a threat. So we'll see. I think there was some pretty dovish comments from Tiff Macklem, really his first public comments since the last rate pause. But anyways, there you go.
Here she was.
Gone.
This one little tidbit on that is just that, be careful what you wish for. Because this is, I mean, in the sense that like we might be cheering the decline. Again, prices are still rising. They're just rising at a slightly slower rate, a rate that it remains above target, PS. But what it also means is that there is aggregate demand is slowing. And we feel that in retail sales. We feel that, I swear we don't feel that in services or restaurant spending, because I can tell you.
No, restaurants are crazy.
Yeah, I know. So so we'll see. But I don't know.
To round out this whole conversation, it was interesting. There was actually a report that went fairly viral about 4 or 5 days ago, just before the budget was announced. Actually, there was a report that was put out by the Scotiabank economics team. And again, Rich, you'll probably appreciate this as a guy that used to run a lot of research, still does, but these models are not perfect. Everybody's, you can't model everything out perfectly, but the Scotiabank's view or data suggested to them that interest rates in Canada are effectively 200 basis points higher than they otherwise could be or should be due to excess spending at the federal government level. So I found that rather interesting that, again, rates are 200 basis points higher. So those people that are sort of complaining about, their mortgage rates and coming up for renewal and really starting to be impacted by it, is ultimately being driven by excess federal government spending. And, clearly that wasn't taken into account when setting this latest budget. So that kind of summarizes. I don't know if you guys have any additional commentary, but
we need a football prediction.
Football.
So those who are watching, this is Turkey Day for the Americans, and my whole career has been involved with U.S. markets, so I always take Thanksgiving Day off. Which for me, of
you
course,
fire up a turkey too?
No, I don't go that route. Usually,
you don't double down, eh?
No, I'm not into it that much. But you do celebrate it with some nice food and things. But yeah, so for my day off, of course, means, podcasts and 2 other meetings and another couple hours of stuff. But it is football day. So Rich has a better story. But very quickly, the 49ers are playing tonight. So that's why I'm rocking my 1985 purchased Joe Montana jersey. But tonight, it's going to be it could be over by halftime, Rich. They could call the game. The last couple of weeks have been pretty good, but tonight it's probably going to be San Francisco, 30 plus points, 34 and maybe 9 for Seattle. So,
wow.
Yeah, it's a big one. But Rich, why don't you share with everyone where you are and what you're doing? Like in 5 minutes from now, you're just
sure. I'll make it quick because I know we got to go. I got to go. So I'm here in Dallas, Texas, the Lone Star State. And we're here with some buddies, basically lads on tour. So we're 5 college buddies. No real reason, maybe because they want to get away from their family and their kids. But we're here. Last night we went to go see the Dallas Stars versus the Vegas Golden Knights. Great crowd, I have to say, as a Canadian hockey fan, as a diehard Montreal Canadiens
Dallas has
fan.
great fans.
They were into it from the word go, way better than Toronto Maple Leaf fans, way better, I'm sorry to say. And then today we're going to go see the Dallas Cowboys play the Washington Commanders, or the Washington Commies, as I prefer the name. But and so I predict the score will be a total blowout. Just because I want to see I want to see a turkey get bludgeoned. No, I think it'll be 29-18. Let's do a weird one.
Are we giving this guy predictions now, Keith?
Yeah, I have to. Come on.
This guy's stealing your show here.
Your shit.
Rich, little
Cut it out.
Little pro tip for this one that you're going to.
Tell me.
The Washington could win this one.
Oh,
This
really?
could-
Okay.
Yeah, they show up for a division game.
Okay.
Yeah. But but go to the I love tailgating, you get to
My friends are yelling at me.
shoot some beer. What do they call it? You punch a hole in the bottom
Shotgun.
of
You shotgun beer. Shotgun a beer.
Keith,
Yeah,
you
Boomer's good at that.
yeah?
Okay.
Fire those
Yeah.
up.
For sure.
All right, guys. I gotta go. Go Cowboys.
It's a good
I'll
place
see
to
you
wrap it
guys
up.
in Toronto next week.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, that's right. Toronto next week.
Toronto, November 30th. See you there. Tickets.
Okay. Take it easy. What is that background?
All right.
Did you guys
See you
that?
next week.